Evelyn smoothed her uniform and took a steadying breath as she prepared for another shift on the majestic horizon, a cruise ship renowned for its luxury and exclusivity. The ship was a floating palace, a haven for billionaires, and a workplace that demanded grace under pressure. Evelyn, now 35, had been working as a waitress aboard the ship for 2 years, adapting to the long shifts, the demanding clientele, and the glimmering world of wealth and opulence. Each day was filled with elegant dinners, polished silverware, and glimpses of a world she could never fully enter. For Evelyn, this job was more than just a way to earn a living. It was an escape after the tragedy that had forever altered her life. 5 years earlier, her husband Daniel had died in an accident that shattered her world. The news had come out of nowhere, leaving her devastated, hollowed out by grief, and facing a future she had never planned on. The first year without him had been a blur of sorrow, isolation, and a struggle to simply keep going. She had spent endless nights awake, lost in memories of their life together. Today, though, Evelyn felt strangely unsettled, as if the ocean itself was stirring up old emotions she had buried deep. She couldn't put her finger on it, but a sense of unease crept through her. The dining area was already bustling with guests when Evelyn entered, her gaze sweeping across the room as she took in the familiar scene. The wealthy patrons filled the space with laughter and conversation, their designer clothes and sparkling jewels reflecting the warm light from chandeliers overhead. She was used to this crowd, accustomed to the mannerisms and expectations of people who lived in a world entirely different from her own. But as she moved through the tables, something caught her eye. A man seated across the room, laughing as he leaned close to a young woman at his side. Evelyn felt her heart jolt, a mixture of disbelief and shock overtaking her. Her grip on the tray tightened, her mind racing as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. It was him. Daniel. Her Daniel. Evelyn's pulse quickened, a wave of emotions crashing over her. She felt as if the world had stopped, the sounds of the dining room fading into silence as she tried to process the impossible sight before her. Daniel had changed, of course. 5 years had passed, and he looked older, his features sharper, more refined. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his hair styled back in a way that made him look polished, almost unrecognizable from the man she had once known so intimately. And yet, there was no mistaking him. She knew that face, those mannerisms, better than anyone. She had spent years grieving this man, mourning the future they'd never have. And now here he was, alive, seated across from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. The woman was beautiful, elegant in a way that suggested she was used to luxury. Her laugh rang out lightly, and she leaned toward Daniel, touching his arm in a way that sent a pang of jealousy and betrayal through Evelyn. A dozen questions raced through Evelyn's mind, each one louder than the last. How was this possible? Why was he here, alive, after all this time? And why had he never come back to her? The memories flooded her, vivid and sharp. She remembered the day she had received the call about his accident, the feeling of her heart breaking as the officer's words washed over her. She remembered the endless days of grief, the sleepless nights, and the slow process of rebuilding her life piece by piece. But seeing him now, with that young woman by his side, was a wound she hadn't been prepared for. Evelyn forced herself to stay steady, her mind and body on autopilot, as she continued moving through the dining area. She couldn't risk drawing attention to herself, couldn't allow anyone to see the shock that threatened to break her composure. But every step she took felt like a weight, pulling her closer to the reality that Daniel was not only alive, but living a life that seemed worlds away from the one they had shared. From where she stood, Evelyn could see the ease with which Daniel interacted with the woman beside him. There was a lightness, a carefree attitude that seemed foreign to the man she had known. This Daniel was confident, self-assured, as if he had stepped into a world of privilege and made it his own. The years they had spent struggling, the dreams they had built, the love they had shared, it all felt like a lie in the face of this new reality. Evelyn's heart ached as she watched them, unable to look away. She felt betrayed, abandoned, as though he had erased her entirely from his life without a second thought. She had been left with grief, with memories that had held her captive, while he had moved on to a world of luxury, of laughter, and of new beginnings. And as she watched him with the young woman, Evelyn realized that everything she had believed about his death, about their life together, had been a cruel illusion. The realization left her shaken, a cold clarity settling over her. She had spent years building herself back up, moving on. But now that she knew the truth, she couldn't simply turn away. She needed answers. She needed to know who this man had become, and why he had left her behind. As the laughter and conversations around her resumed, Evelyn felt the sting of betrayal transform into something sharper, something that compelled her to take action. She knew she couldn't confront him now, not here, but the shock of seeing him had awakened something inside her, a desire for justice, for understanding, for closure. Evelyn straightened, gripping the tray a little tighter as she resumed her duties, her gaze flickering back to Daniel and the young woman one last time. She had spent years as a ghost in his absence, but now, she would ensure he could never ignore her again. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stared at Daniel, trying to reconcile the impossible truth before her. She felt her grip on the tray tighten as she struggled to stay composed, the room spinning slightly as her emotions battled within her. Here's Daniel, changed, older, wealthier, but undeniably him. Each beat of her heart echoed the years she had mourned him, the countless moments spent grieving his absence. And yet, here he was, alive, seated just feet away, laughing with a young woman, as if nothing in their shared past had ever mattered. Her mind swam with disbelief, her chest heavy with the weight of confusion and hurt. This couldn't be happening. Daniel's death had been the defining tragedy of her life, the point at which everything had crumbled. She had spent years piecing herself back together, learning to live without him, and now, the very foundation of her grief felt like a lie. She felt her vision blur, her hands growing unsteady. The sharpness of betrayal clawed at her heart, each passing second heightening her emotions until they began to overflow. Without thinking, she took a step backward, her focus broken just enough to lose control of the tray in her hands. With a sudden clattering noise, the glass slipped from her fingers, tipping over and spilling wine across the pristine table nearby. The guests gasped, their expressions a mix of surprise and irritation as they looked up to see what had caused the disruption. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Evelyn stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as she reached for a napkin. Her hands trembled as she tried to blot the spill, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the shock of Daniel's presence. Another waiter, sensing her distress, quickly stepped in. "I'll handle it, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice gentle but firm. He took the tray from her hands, giving her a look that suggested she should take a moment to gather herself. Grateful for the excuse to escape, Evelyn nodded, barely managing a whispered, "Thank you." She stepped away, her heart pounding as she navigated her way through the tables, ignoring the curious stares from guests. Reaching the kitchen door, she slipped inside, breathing a sigh of relief as the bustling sounds of the dining area faded behind her. Inside the kitchen, Evelyn leaned against the cool metal countertop, her hands pressed against the edge as she struggled to steady her breaths. Her chest felt tight, her pulse racing with an intensity that made her lightheaded. She closed her eyes, willing herself to calm down, but the emotions refused to settle. They churned inside her, fierce and unyielding, refusing to be suppressed. She was back in the small, dimly lit chapel, her body weighed down by the oppressive grief that had consumed her in the days after his death. The air had been thick with the scent of lilies, the scent now forever associated with loss in her mind. She remembered the quiet murmurs of condolence, the sympathetic pats on her shoulder, the hollow phrases meant to comfort her, but that only served to deepen her pain. Evelyn remembered every moment with excruciating clarity. She had barely been able to stand, leaning on her mother for support as the service began. She had wanted to scream, to protest that this couldn't be real, that it wasn't her Daniel lying in that casket. But all she could do was sit in silent agony, trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. The service had passed in a blur, the grief settling in her bones, numbing her to everything around her. Afterward, she had stood alone by the casket, her fingers brushing against the polished wood, struggling to accept that the man she loved was gone. She had felt empty, hollowed out, like a shell of the person she once was. The reality of Daniel's death had shattered her in ways she could never fully articulate. She had spent years in that grief, mourning the life they had planned to share, the dreams they had built together. And yet, every tear, every sleepless night had been built on a lie. The pain of that realization now clawed at her, the betrayal cutting deeper than any grief she'd experienced. Evelyn's fingers dug into the countertop as she forced herself back to the present, her breath shallow and uneven. How could he do this to her? How could he leave her to mourn him, to build a life without him, only to reappear now, as if her suffering had been inconsequential? The image of Daniel's face lingered in her mind, laughing, carefree, without a trace of regret or guilt. He had moved on, found someone else, rebuilt his life without so much as a backward glance. She, meanwhile, had been haunted by his absence, bound to memories that had clearly meant nothing to him. The hurt was unbearable, a raw, festering wound that reopened with every thought of him. Evelyn felt her eyes sting, tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them back, a surge of anger rising to the surface. She had given him everything, loved him unconditionally, and this was the life he had chosen instead. She inhaled sharply, willing herself to hold on, to regain control over her emotions. Her thoughts swirled with questions, each one more painful than the last. What kind of man was he, to feign his death and abandon her so callously? And who was the young woman sitting beside him, looking at him with adoration, unaware of the trail of devastation he'd left behind? Evelyn straightened, forcing herself to take a steadying breath. He wouldn't let this break her, not again. She had suffered enough, and now she needed answers. She would find out why Daniel had left her, why he had allowed her to believe he was dead while he crafted a new life for himself. The grief she'd carried for years was shifting, transforming into something sharper, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before the need for justice. Glancing around the kitchen, Evelyn took a final grounding breath. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't simply walk away from this revelation, not when everything she had believed in was now shattered. This was a turning point, a moment she could no longer ignore. Her past had collided with her present, and now there was no going back. Evelyn took one final steadying breath, adjusting her uniform with trembling hands. She had mourned Daniel once, in agony and solitude. But now, faced with this strange and painful truth, she felt herself harden with resolve. She wasn't about to let the man who had abandoned her carry on, as though she had never existed. Her fingers brushed the door handle, and with her mind reeling, she pushed it open and stepped back into the dining area, prepared to confront the reality of the man Daniel had become. The low hum of conversation filled the room, and Evelyn moved carefully, her eyes scanning the tables until they settled on him again. Daniel was still there, laughing and leaning close to the young woman by his side. From where she stood, Evelyn could see the casual intimacy between them, the way he moved with ease, his gaze fixed on the woman with an intensity that struck her heart like a blow. He looked so at ease, so comfortable in this world of wealth and indulgence. It was a confidence she had never seen in him before, a sense of ownership over his surroundings that felt almost unnatural. Evelyn studied his face, trying to reconcile the man she once loved with the figure before her. His features were sharper, more defined, his hair neatly styled in a way that radiated sophistication. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he looked every bit the part of a wealthy businessman, far from the struggling man she had once known. She felt a pang of disbelief. The Daniel she remembered had been reserved, practical, and always worried about their finances. This man was a stranger, exuding a kind of effortless power and wealth that seemed worlds apart from the life they had shared. Her gaze shifted to the young woman beside him. Alana. Evelyn didn't know her, but it didn't take much to see that she was young, likely no more than 22 or 23. Alana radiated the kind of elegance that came with new money, each of her gestures graceful, a polished diamond among the crowd. She wore a designer dress that hugged her figure perfectly, and her laughter rang out lightly, drawing attention from nearby tables as she leaned close to Daniel, a hand resting on his arm. Evelyn felt her heart twist as she watched them. This woman, so much younger and more glamorous, seemed to embody everything Daniel had traded his past for. The realization hit her like a wave. Daniel had built a new life, a life of wealth and privilege, and had done so without her. He hadn't just disappeared. He had chosen to abandon her, leaving her to grieve alone, so he could pursue a life she would never be part of. Evelyn's mind drifted back to the years they had shared, memories filling her with a fresh ache as she took in the reality of the man he had become. She remembered long nights spent together in their small apartment, the quiet conversations that had once defined their relationship. Daniel had struggled, facing endless setbacks in his career. Money had been tight, their future uncertain, but they'd leaned on each other, drawn closer by the hardships they endured together. Evelyn had worked late shifts, often picking up extra hours just to help them make ends meet, reassuring Daniel on the nights when he felt overwhelmed. She had been there for him, giving everything she had to support him through every doubt and every failure. But now, seeing him with Alana, Evelyn realized that he had used her loyalty as a stepping stone, something to leave behind when he no longer needed it. He hadn't died, as she had believed. He had simply shed his old life to embrace something new, something easier, wealthier, more polished. He had faked his death, erasing the past they shared so he could start fresh. Her hands clenched at her sides as she tried to process the depth of his betrayal. She had been left to carry the weight of his death, forced to reconstruct her life from the ruins, while he had simply walked away, free to reinvent himself without a second thought. And here he was, seated across from Alana, a living symbol of everything he had chosen over her. The bitterness within her grew sharper, mingling with the pain of abandonment. She had been his anchor, his unwavering support. She had given him everything she could, believing in their shared dreams. And now, he had replaced her with a younger, wealthier life partner, someone who fit this new image he had crafted for himself. She watched as Alana laughed, tossing her hair back, her gaze fixed adoringly on Daniel, oblivious to the man's past and the trail of destruction he had left behind. As Evelyn continued to observe them, the memories replayed in her mind like fragments of a film, moments of sacrifice and love that felt like cruel mockery now. She had mourned him, mourned the life they'd never have, while he had built a new world, shrouded in luxury, far removed from the struggles they'd endured together. But there was something she noticed, something beyond the easy charm Daniel was projecting. She could see a hint of performance in his movements, a carefully controlled facade he wore for the world. He wasn't just relaxed. He was projecting an image, displaying a life he wanted people to believe he owned. Each gesture, each glance was practiced, almost rehearsed, like he was proving to himself that he belonged in this world. Evelyn took a steadying breath as she processed this realization. Daniel hadn't just left her, he had transformed himself, erasing the man he once was to embrace this carefully crafted persona. She was suddenly struck by the need to understand what had driven him to take such drastic measures. What had fueled this desire for wealth, this need to shed his past so completely? As she watched him and Alana, Evelyn felt her emotions shift from betrayal to a fierce determination. She could no longer ignore the truth, the ugly reality of the man Daniel had become. She deserved answers. She needed to know why he had chosen this path, why he had discarded their life so ruthlessly. Straightening her posture, Evelyn took one last look at them before turning away, her mind whirling with questions. This wasn't the end. She couldn't confront him here, but she would find a way to make him see what he had done, to understand the cost of the life he had built on her suffering. Evelyn left the dining area, her heart still racing with a mixture of pain and determination. Daniel's betrayal had left her hollow once, but she now felt a powerful sense of purpose building within her. She couldn't let him carry on in this life of lies, and she certainly couldn't bear the burden of his deceit alone any longer. As she returned to her cabin that night, exhaustion mixed with a heavy weight of grief. Her emotions had reached a breaking point, and the thought of bearing this secret alone filled her with a loneliness that was nearly unbearable. Claire, her roommate of the past year, was already seated on her bunk, a book open on her lap. She looked up as Evelyn entered, her face softening at the sight of Evelyn's tense expression. "Hey, you okay?" Claire asked gently, setting her book aside. She could always sense when something was wrong, and tonight, the question felt like the key to opening the floodgates Evelyn had been trying so desperately to hold back. Without another word, Evelyn sank onto her bunk, burying her face in her hands. She took a shaky breath, unable to suppress the emotions any longer. "Claire, there's something I have to tell you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Claire's expression shifted to one of concern, and she moved closer, listening intently. "Of course, Evelyn. Whatever it is, I'm here." Evelyn lifted her head, meeting Claire's steady gaze, and the story began to spill out. "Today I saw someone I thought I'd never see again," she said, her voice wavering. "My husband, Daniel. He's alive, Claire. After all these years, he's here on this ship." A mixture of shock and disbelief crossed Claire's face, but she stayed quiet, allowing Evelyn the space to continue. "He faked his own death, Claire. He left me, let me believe he was gone, all so he could build a new life. And he has changed. He is wealthy now, confident, like a completely different person." Evelyn's hands clenched as she relived the pain of that discovery. "He was with a young woman, laughing, acting like nothing we went through ever mattered." "Oh," Evelyn, Claire whispered, placing a gentle hand on Evelyn's arm. Her expression was a mixture of sympathy and quiet fury on Evelyn's behalf. "I can't imagine how that must have felt. To see him like that." Evelyn nodded, her chest tight. "I can't let him go on pretending he doesn't have a past, Claire. I spent years mourning him, building a life without him, and he just discarded me. I need to understand why he did this. I need the truth." Claire squeezed her arm, her voice filled with empathy. "You're not alone in this, Evelyn. If you need help, if there's anything I can do, I'll be here for you." Her words offered a comfort that Evelyn hadn't realized she needed. Claire's presence felt grounding, a reminder that she didn't have to carry this burden alone. "Thank you, Claire. I don't know what to do, but I know I can't face him, not yet. And there's something off about his behavior. It's not just that he's moved on, there's more to it. Something hidden." Claire's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, Evelyn, you're not the only one who's noticed odd things about him. Some of the staff have mentioned seeing him in strange places, meeting with unusual guests who aren't here for the cruise. If you want, I could introduce you to a few of them. They might be able to help." The idea sparked a glimmer of hope in Evelyn's mind. Having allies among the staff would allow her to keep an eye on Daniel's activities without drawing attention to herself. She looked at Claire with gratitude. "Do you think they'd be willing to help?" Claire nodded. "Absolutely. Tony, the head bartender, is discreet and sharp. He notices everything and is trustworthy. Then there's Rosa, one of the housekeepers. She often overhears conversations in the guest suites. And Sam, a deckhand, knows the ship inside and out. We could bring them into the loop, and they might be able to keep an eye on Daniel's activities." Over the next few days, with Claire's help, Evelyn discreetly connected with these trusted crew members. They arranged to meet during breaks, gathering in quiet corners of the ship where they wouldn't be seen or overheard. Their willingness to help left Evelyn both surprised and grateful, and as they shared their observations, it became clear that Daniel's presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Tony, the bartender, was the first to join. He listened intently as Evelyn explained her situation, his eyes widening with recognition when she described Daniel's transformation. "I knew there was something off about that guy," Tony said, lowering his voice. "He orders expensive drinks, barely touches them but makes sure everyone sees the label. It's like he's performing, putting on a show. I thought he was just a show-off, but now makes me wonder." Rosa, The housekeeper nodded as she shared her observations. "I've cleaned his suite a few times," she murmured, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I've overheard him on the phone talking about risks and profits. He never sounded like someone on vacation, more like his conducting business. And his careful, tool ways lowers his voice when I'm around, even if I'm just outside in the hallway." Sam, the deckhand, joined them last, his expression serious as he listened to Evelyn's story. "I've seen him meeting people who don't look like the typical crowd," he added. "Well-dressed, private types. They're not here to enjoy the ocean views, if you catch my drift. Something's going on with him, and it's not the kind of business you'd expect on a luxury cruise." The group exchanged glances, each piece of information building a more complex and troubling picture of Daniel's new life. Evelyn's suspicions had been correct. Daniel wasn't just living a lie. He was entangled in something deeper, something that went beyond simple wealth and privilege. And now, with the support of her new allies, she felt the beginnings of a plan forming, a way to uncover the truth of Daniel's hidden life. "I ain't thank you all enough," Evelyn said, looking at each of them in turn. "I know this is asking a lot, but I need to know why he did this, why he left me and built a new life. If we keep an eye on him, maybe we can figure it out." Tony nodded, his expression resolute. "We're in this with you, Evelyn. Whatever he's hiding, we will help you uncover it." The group agreed to discreetly observe Daniel whenever possible, sharing any details or snippets of conversation they managed to gather. They knew the risks involved, but their loyalty to Evelyn and their sense of justice strengthened their commitment. Each member of her small team had a role to play, and as Evelyn returned to her cabin that night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in her quest for answers, and with the help of her allies, she was determined to uncover every lie, every secret that Daniel had built his new life upon. The road ahead would be challenging, but Evelyn knew she couldn't turn back now. The betrayal she had once buried had resurfaced, fueling her resolve to find the truth. Evelyn's newfound allies had given her both a sense of strength and a practical advantage. With Tony, Rosa, Sam, and Claire discreetly supporting her, she could begin watching Daniel more closely, piecing together clues about the life he had built in her absence. The shock of his betrayal had left her raw, but now her grief was morphing into a quiet determination to understand exactly who Daniel had become. In the days that followed, Evelyn adjusted her shifts strategically, arranging her duties to keep herself near Daniel's usual table. Each evening, he and Alana would arrive for dinner at around the same time, often choosing a spot on the upper deck where the lights cast a warm glow over the tables, and the soft sounds of the ocean added an air of exclusivity to the setting. Evelyn worked to maintain an air of professionalism, slipping by their table casually to refill drinks or clear plates, her expression neutral, her gaze never lingering for too long. But each time she passed, she noted every detail, every word she could overhear. It didn't take long for Evelyn to recognize patterns in Daniel's behavior. The man she remembered had always been somewhat reserved, but this new Daniel reveled in attention, his gestures animated, his voice loud enough to turn heads. He often spoke of business dealings and investments, though he kept his language vague, clearly skilled at skirting around details. But even without specifics, Evelyn began to gather hints of the life he had constructed. One evening, as she refilled their wine glasses, she caught a snippet of conversation that sent a chill down her spine. "With the offshore accounts, everything's secure," Daniel said, leaning back with a smug smile. "We've kept it clean, and the network's tight. There's no chance of it tracing back." Evelyn's hand nearly faltered, but she steadied herself, masking her reaction as she quietly moved to the next table. Offshore accounts. Networks. She had been right. Daniel hadn't just built a new life, he had constructed a fortress of secrets around himself, hiding his wealth in places she could barely comprehend. She glanced back, watching as Alana's eyes sparkled with interest. The young woman listened attentively, hanging on his every word, occasionally glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Alana's fascination was unmistakable, her gaze alight with the same admiration Evelyn herself had once had. But it was different. While Evelyn had admired Daniel's character, his ambition, Alana seemed captivated by something far more material. Her gaze lingered on his watch, his suit, even his mannerisms, as though each detail was a validation of his wealth and status. Evelyn's heart tightened as she realized Alana wasn't with him for the man he was, but for what he could provide. She saw Alana's subtle gestures, the way she would lean in when he mentioned an investment or a property, her interest sharpening at the mention of accounts or financial terms. It was clear that Alana was as invested in Daniel's riches as he was in the illusion of power he projected. They were both building their relationship on wealth and pretense, feeding off each other's ambitions and vanity. As Evelyn continued observing, she noticed other small signs of Daniel's arrogance. He treated the waitstaff with a barely veiled sense of superiority, his tone clipped, his patience thin. The Daniel she remembered had been humble, even gentle, and she felt a pang of sorrow each time she saw this new version of him snap at a server for an insignificant delay or complain about something minor. But perhaps it was all part of the new identity he had created, this wealthy, self-important man who saw others as tools rather than equals. One night, Tony caught Evelyn as she cleared the table nearby, giving her a discreet nod. "Did you hear what he said about that new acquisition?" he murmured as he passed by with a tray of drinks. "He's talking about it like it's a game, another status symbol." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "He's not the same man," she whispered. "And it's not just wealth. He has built himself a fortress of lies, and she's feeding off it." Later that evening, as she worked to clear tables nearby, she overheard Daniel and Alana discussing travel plans. "We could head to the private island after this," Alana was saying, her voice light and teasing. "I love that place. It feels like freedom." Daniel chuckled, his hand covering hers on the table. "Freedom, yes, and privacy. No one there to pry, no one to ask questions. It's perfect." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "That's why I chose it. Total discretion. No one knows a thing about what I've built there." Evelyn's heart pounded as she pretended to adjust silverware nearby, catching every word. Private island. Discretion. He had built his new life on wealth, privilege, and secrecy, hiding behind walls of money and distance, ensuring no one could find out the truth. Everything about him was a carefully constructed facade, shielded by wealth and status. The realization struck her with cold clarity. Daniel's death hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. He had deliberately erased himself from his old life, cutting ties and cloaking his new one in layers of secrecy, all to pursue a world she would never have fit into. He had replaced her with wealth, and now, with Alana, young, impressionable woman who adored his riches as much as he adored his new identity. As Evelyn continued to observe over the next few days, the full picture of Daniel's deceit grew clearer. His conversations often danced around risky deals, shady investments, and the maintenance of offshore accounts, each phrase laced with an undercurrent of arrogance. He wasn't just reveling in his wealth, he was flaunting it, embracing a dangerous lifestyle where power meant freedom from accountability. The illusion he had created was flawless at least to those who didn't know his past. Watching him now, Evelyn felt a strange mixture of pity and anger. She pitied the man he had become, a man enslaved to his own greed and arrogance. But she also felt a burning anger at the ease with which he had erased her, replacing their shared dreams with a life rooted in lies. Each shift, Evelyn gathered more details, her mind racing as she pieced together fragments of Daniel's conversations, the lavish plans he hinted at, the fortune he had amassed through means she could only guess at. The pain of his betrayal transformed into a steady, quiet resolve. The more she observed, the more determined she became to expose him for who he truly was. With her allies discreetly watching alongside her, Evelyn felt a glimmer of strength. She would not let him escape his past, nor would she allow him to keep this fortress of lies intact. She had mourned him once, believing in the finality of his death. But now she was determined to make him face the truth he had worked so hard to bury. Evelyn's gaze flickered back to Daniel and Alana one last time that evening, taking in the scene before her with a newfound clarity. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by this stranger, a man who had traded loyalty and love for wealth and pretense. Each passing day added to the intricate web Evelyn and her allies were weaving around Daniel. With every shift and every encounter, her small team quietly monitored his movements and observed his interactions, piecing together fragments of the life he had carefully hidden. Evelyn's initial shock and despair had transformed into something else, simmering determination and a feeling of control she hadn't experienced since Daniel's supposed death. Thanks to their coordinated efforts, Evelyn was always aware of Daniel's whereabouts. Tony, the bartender, had an uncanny ability to track the guests' movements in the lounges and bars. Whenever Daniel arrived, Tony would discreetly pass along a heads-up, noting which of his business partners joined him or which luxury drink he ordered to keep up appearances. Sam, the deckhand, often kept a low profile on the ship's upper decks, where he could monitor the flow of guests, ensuring that Evelyn knew if Daniel had retreated to a secluded part of the ship or arranged a private meeting away from prying eyes. But it was Rosa, the maid, who proved invaluable in obtaining small but meaningful pieces of information. She had a knack for overhearing phone conversations, and Daniel's arrogance meant he rarely bothered to keep his voice down, even when discussing sensitive topics. Each snippet she managed to gather, each whispered comment she shared, only added fuel to Evelyn's determination. Daniel's life wasn't just one of wealth, it was steeped in secrets and shadowy dealings that had left a trail of deceit. One evening, as Evelyn was preparing to start her shift, Tony slipped her a small piece of paper as he passed her on his way to the bar. She unfolded it, reading the quick scrawl, "Private lounge tonight." Recording started. Her pulse quickened as she tucked the note away, keeping her expression neutral. This was the closest they had come to real evidence, something tangible that could expose Daniel's true nature. That night, Tony would use his AirPods to covertly record Daniel's conversation, and Evelyn felt a surge of anticipation. She was no longer alone in her struggle. She had allies who understood the stakes and were willing to help her gather proof of Daniel's misdeeds. Later, as the lounge filled with guests dressed in glittering attire, Evelyn moved gracefully from table to table, casting the occasional discreet glance at Tony. He nodded ever so slightly, a silent confirmation that Daniel had arrived and the recording was in progress. She worked the floor, her eyes taking in the scene while she served guests, her movements calm and practiced. Near the bar, Daniel was seated comfortably, Alana at his side, looking as radiant and enthralled as ever. Evelyn's gaze lingered on them for a moment, but her attention quickly shifted to the man seated across from Daniela, new face, sharply dressed, his demeanor exuding quiet authority. He leaned in as they talked, nodding as Daniel spoke animatedly, his hands moving as if he were explaining some grand scheme. Evelyn edged closer, her ears straining to catch snippets of conversation. The hum of the lounge made it difficult to hear every word, but the occasional phrase drifted over offshore accounts, liability, tax shelter. She felt her jaw tighten, the pieces of Daniel's carefully constructed world falling into place with each word. He was not just hiding his wealth, he was actively manipulating it, using every loophole he could find to evade authorities and increase his fortune. Evelyn caught Tony's eye, his subtle nod signaling that the conversation had been recorded. Relief mingled with satisfaction as she straightened, refocusing on her duties. She was no longer a passive observer in Daniel's life. She was actively gathering the ammunition she needed to expose his lies. The power he had once held over her was slipping, and each small victory added to her strength. Later that evening, as the lounge emptied and the last of the guests returned to their suites, Evelyn met with her allies in a quiet corner of the crew quarters. Tony held up his phone, his face alight with a quiet satisfaction. "I have got it," he murmured. He was bragging, talking about how he has been able to legally avoid taxes by moving his assets offshore and using fake accounts. He even threw in some details about his private island. It is all on here. He handed Evelyn the recording, and as she played it back, Daniel's voice filled the small space, his tone laced with arrogance and pride. Easy enough once you know the right people. You just need to set up the right accounts, keep everything clean on paper. And authorities? They would not even know where to begin looking, he laughed. And besides, who is going to bother me? The money is mine to protect, and I have earned every bit of it. The word sent a chill through Evelyn, her grip on the phone tightening. This was Daniel at his core, a man who valued wealth and power over honesty, who would go to any lengths to protect his empire. And here, in his own voice, was the evidence she had been searching for. Rosa leaned in, her expression fierce. That is it, Evelyn. This is proof that he is hiding things. We are with you every step. Evelyn nodded, feeling her confidence deepen. With her allies' support and Daniel's words captured on recording, she finally had the leverage she needed. She was not just seeking revenge anymore. She was preparing to expose him to the world, to reveal the man he had become, and the lies he had woven. In the days that followed, the network's efforts only intensified. With Tani's recordings, Sam's observations of Daniel's meetings, and Rosa's discreet information gathering, Evelyn's understanding of Daniel's empire grew. Every whispered conversation, every hint of hidden assets, painted a clearer picture of the tangled web he had constructed. One evening, Sam intercepted her just before her shift. I saw him with another guy this morning. Not the usual. This one looked serious. Like he is not here for leisure. Evelyn's curiosity flared. Did you hear anything? Sam shook his head. They kept it quiet. But I'm telling you, Evelyn, this was not a friendly visit. Something is brewing. Evelyn filed the information away, every small piece coming together to reveal a dangerous side of Daniel she had never imagined. He had left her to grieve his loss while building a life that was not only deceitful, but perilous. Her heart ached with the realization that the man she had once loved was gone, replaced by this stranger who valued wealth over integrity, status over love. That night, back in her cabin, Evelyn reviewed the recordings Tony had managed to capture. Each word, each laugh of Daniel's, only solidified her resolve. She could feel the strength of her network behind her, their quiet but unyielding support, lending her the courage she needed. Evelyn lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She was no longer powerless, no longer just a grieving widow clinging to the memory of a man who had betrayed her. She had allies, evidence, and a purpose. And soon, Daniel would see that she was no longer the woman he had left behind. She was ready to expose him for everything he was. Evelyn felt a surge of confidence with each new piece of information her allies managed to uncover. She had gone from being a grieving widow to a woman with a mission, empowered by the network she had built around her. And now, with concrete evidence in her hands, she was closer than ever to exposing the man Daniel had become. Yet, a part of her knew this confrontation would only intensify. The closer she got to Daniel's secrets, the riskier her mission became. Late one evening, Evelyn found herself near a secluded lounge where she knew Daniel and Alana often held their private conversation. The door was slightly ajar, the low murmur of their voices drifting into the empty hallway. She paused, pressing herself quietly against the wall and listening intently, her heart pounding. Their words were just audible enough to pick up fragments of Daniel's latest schemes. He spoke of transactions and profits, his tone laced with arrogance as he boasted about his latest acquisition. But it was Alana's response that piqued Evelyn's interest. Alana's laughter was soft, mocking, almost as if she were egging him on. "So, you are untouchable, are you not?" Alana purred. "Nobody would dare question a man like you, especially with all those legal tricks you have set up." Evelyn's grip on the doorframe tightened, a surge of anger flaring up as she listened. Alana's voice carried an undertone of satisfaction, as if she took as much pride in Daniel's schemes as he did. It was clear that Alana was deeply invested in this life of wealth and pretense, as enamored with Daniel's ill-gotten gains as she was with him. Leaning in slightly, Evelyn adjusted her position, careful to remain hidden. But in that quiet hallway, her movement caused a slight creak from the floor beneath her, barely more than a whisper, but loud enough to break the rhythm of Daniel and Elena's conversation. She held her breath, hoping they had not heard. But it was too late. The talking ceased abruptly, and Evelyn heard Alana's footsteps drawing closer. Her heart raced as Alana stepped away from Daniel, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor. Evelyn barely had time to pull herself back when Alana appeared in the doorway, her gaze narrowing as she spotted Evelyn standing there, caught in the act. A slow, smug smile spread across Alana's face as she folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe with a mocking glint in her eye. "Well, well," she murmured, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I thought I heard someone snooping around. Eavesdropping now, are we?" Evelyn straightened, meeting Alana's gaze, forcing herself to remain calm, even as her heart thundered in her chest. "I was just passing by," she said coolly, though she knew there was no point in denying it. Alana's expression made it clear she was fully aware of Evelyn's intent. Alana's smirk widened, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that made Evelyn's skin prickle. "Oh, come on, Evelyn," she said, her tone patronizing. "We both know that is not true. You are not here by accident, are you?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know exactly who you are." The admission hit Evelyn like a slap, but she held her ground, unwilling to give Alana the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "And who do you think I am, then?" she replied, her voice steady. Alana chuckled softly, her gaze sweeping over Evelyn with thinly veiled disdain. "Oh, I know more than you think. You are the woman Daniel left behind, the one who grieved while he built his empire." She raised an eyebrow, her tone mocking. "You really did him a favor, you know, by disappearing from his life. It made it all so much easier for him and for me." Evelyn felt a rush of anger at Alana's words, the audacity with which she dismissed Evelyn's pain, her loss, as if it were nothing more than a stepping stone in her and Daniel's new life. But she refused to let Alana see the hurt beneath her anger, meeting her gaze with a look of defiance. "Taking myself out of the picture?" Evelyn repeated, her voice cool. "Is that what you think happened?" "Oh, I know that is what happened," Alana replied, her voice low and condescending. She crossed her arms, her smirk deepening. "Thanks to you, I get to live a life you only dreamed of. I get to sit beside him, benefit from his wealth and power, while you are what? Serving drinks and lurking in the shadows?" She laughed, the sound cutting through the quiet hallway. "If I were you, I would stop meddling and just be grateful I am even here." Evelyn's fists clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Alana," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Because when the truth comes out, you will regret every minute you spent with him." Alana's smirk faded, her expression hardening as she regarded Evelyn with narrowed eyes. "Is that a threat?" she sneered. "It is a promise," Evelyn replied, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "You think you know him, but you have no idea what he is capable of. You are just as disposable to him as I was." Alana scoffed, tossing her hair back with a look of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "He needs me," she replied with a smirk. "I am the one beside him now, not you. So go ahead, try whatever you want. But remember, you are the one standing here alone, and I am the one in his life." With one final mocking smile, Alana turned and walked back toward the lounge. Evelyn watched as she returned to Daniel's side, slipping into her role seamlessly. He looked up, his expression softening as Alana approached. "What happened, honey?" he asked, reaching for her hand. "Nothing," Alana replied smoothly, casting a glance back toward the hallway where Evelyn stood. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction, her lips curling into a smirk as she took her seat beside Daniel. Her head tilted confidently, as if daring Evelyn to challenge her further. The encounter left Evelyn shaken, her heart pounding with both anger and a renewed sense of purpose. Alana had laid her cards on the table, revealing not only her knowledge of Evelyn's past, but her open enjoyment of the pain Daniel had inflicted. Yet, instead of feeling defeated, Evelyn felt a surge of determination. Alana's taunts and smug confidence only fueled her desire to see this through to the end. As she walked away from the lounge, Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities. She could not confront Daniel now, nor could she risk exposing her intentions just yet. But this confrontation had reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. Daniel had abandoned her, built a life of lies, and used his wealth to erase his past, and Alana had eagerly stepped into her place, reveling in the world Daniel had created. But they were both living on borrowed time. Evelyn knew she was not powerless anymore. She had allies, she had evidence, and most importantly, she had resolve. This was not just about revenge, it was about reclaiming her own power, about exposing the truth of the man who had betrayed her. With renewed determination, Evelyn set her sights on the path ahead, ready to bring Daniel's empire crashing down, and to expose Alana for the opportunist she truly was. The game had changed, and Evelyn was prepared to see it through to the very end. The confrontation with Alana had left Evelyn feeling more resolute than ever. Standing there, taunted by a woman who so proudly flaunted her place beside Daniel, Evelyn's resolve had solidified into something unbreakable. This was no longer just about justice or revenge, it was about reclaiming her life and making sure Daniel faced the consequences of his choices. Over the following days, Evelyn carefully gathered everything her network had assembled. She met with Tony, Rosa, Sam, and Claire in quiet corners of the ship, each of them discreetly passing along recordings, photos, and snippets of conversations they had managed to capture. The evidence was staggering: recordings of Daniel discussing offshore accounts, boasting about tax evasion, and manipulating financial transactions. Photos of him and Alana in intimate moments, showing their close and ultimately incriminating relationship, and detailed notes of meetings with mysterious figures who were not there for leisure. Back in her cabin one evening, Evelyn laid out all the information before her, meticulously arranging each piece. The collection was damning. Her allies had risked much to help her, and Evelyn knew she could trust them as she assembled the final pieces of the puzzle. Together, they created a comprehensive case file that would not only ruin Daniel's reputation, but would ensure that his illegal dealings could not be dismissed or buried. That night, she sat in front of her laptop, scanning through the compiled evidence one last time. The weight of it hit her as she realized just how much Daniel had changed, how deeply he had embedded himself in a life of deception. With every carefully curated piece of evidence, she saw the man she had once loved for who he truly was, someone willing to abandon everything, everyone, to gain wealth and power. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn crafted her message. She attached the file, filling the email fields with the names of multiple news outlets and authorities she had meticulously researched. Each one had the power to launch a high-profile investigation, to make sure Daniel's actions were exposed to the public and scrutinized by the law. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the send button for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. This was the final step, the moment that would bring everything to light. She exhaled, pressing the button decisively. The emails vanished from her screen, sent to every source on her list. Evelyn leaned back, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. It was done. The next morning, the ship made its scheduled stop in Italy. The bright Italian sun cast a golden glow over the harbor as the passengers disembarked for a day of exploration. Evelyn, dressed casually but with an air of elegance, made her way toward the exit, her steps light and purposeful. She carried only a small bag, leaving behind the weight of the past and looking forward to a well-deserved respite. As she reached the end of the gangway, she heard familiar voices behind her: Daniel and Alana. She turned, catching sight of them standing at the ship's railing, their faces twisted in fury as they spotted her. Daniel's face was red, his mouth moving furiously as he yelled something incoherent, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the bustling port. Alana stood beside him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and rage as she realized the full scope of what Evelyn had done. Evelyn's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile as she raised a hand in a mock farewell. With a relaxed ease, she put on her sunglasses, tilting her head slightly to meet their enraged gazes one last time. Daniel's mouth continued to move, his arm flailing as he pointed in her direction, but his words no longer had any power over her. The weight of his betrayal had been lifted, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt free. Just as she turned to leave, the sound of police sirens cut through the noise of the harbor. Several police officers moved through the crowd, making their way toward the ship. Evelyn watched as they boarded, their faces set with purpose as they approached Daniel and Alana. The officers moved with calm efficiency, clearly aware of the high-profile scandal that was about to unfold. Daniel's anger quickly morphed into panic as the officers addressed him, their words lost in the distance but their purpose unmistakable. Alana clutched at his arm, her expression a mask of horror as she realized the gravity of the situation. Evelyn could see them gesturing, trying to explain, but there would be no excuses that could undo the damning evidence now spreading through every major news outlet. Evelyn took one last look, her heart swelling with a sense of closure she had not thought possible. She turned her back on the scene, stepping into the bustling streets of Italy, the vibrant sounds of life surrounding her. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her as she walked away from the ship, leaving behind the shadows of her past and embracing the promise of a future that was finally her own. Her plans for the days ahead were simply relax, explore, and enjoy the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. She had already been in touch with her lawyers, who were working to retrieve the assets Daniel had hidden under the guise of his death. This new life, one where she was in control, felt like a reward after years of grief and betrayal. It was a life she could now build on her own terms. Evelyn strolled through the Italian streets, each step light and purposeful. She did not look back. The distant sound of sirens and the faint memory of Daniel's betrayal had no hold on her anymore. She had faced her past, exposed the truth, and walked away victorious. The sun shone brightly overhead as Evelyn found herself by the water, taking in the beautiful horizon that stretched endlessly before her. She was finally free from lies, free from betrayal, and free to shape a life filled with possibility. As the last whispers of her old life faded behind her, Evelyn felt a calm resolve settle over her. She had reclaimed her story, her power, and her future. And as she looked out at the sparkling waves, Evelyn knew that whatever came next, it would be her choice alone. Years later, the sun cast a golden glow over the endless blue horizon, the ocean stretching out peacefully in every direction. Evelyn leaned back in her lounge chair, sipping from a crystal glass of champagne as the luxury cruise ship gently glided through the calm waters. It was a scene she had once only glimpsed from the other side, waiting tables and filling glasses. Now she was a guest, savoring the life she had fought to reclaim. It had been months since the scandal broke, and the fallout had been swift and unforgiving. The evidence she had compiled and sent to the authorities had done its job. Daniel's carefully constructed empire unraveled, his accounts frozen, his assets seized, and his connections exposed for their illegal dealings. The authorities had not hesitated to open a high-profile investigation, and before long he was arrested, his downfall plastered across every news outlet. Daniel's trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and now, stripped of his wealth and influence, he was just another name in a list of disgraced financiers. Evelyn had watched from a distance as his world collapsed, each headline a reminder of the closure she had fought so hard to achieve. Her compensation from the case had been generous, a small but satisfying reparation for everything she had endured. With it, she had finally been able to secure the life she deserved, a life she had been forced to give up when Daniel faked his death and left her behind. Now, as she basked in the warm glow of the sun, Evelyn felt a profound sense of peace. The life she had once built with Daniel had been destroyed, but in its place, she had crafted something entirely her own. She was free from the burdens of grief and betrayal, and each passing day felt like a gift she had earned. A quiet murmur of voices reached her ears as a group of waitstaff moved gracefully across the deck, trays balanced expertly in their hands. The sight stirred memories of her own days on the ship, working tirelessly to keep up with the demands of the wealthy passengers. But now, the roles were reversed, and she was the one enjoying the luxury and service. As she looked around, her gaze landed on a familiar figure among the waitstaff. Alana, dressed in the same crisp uniform Evelyn had once worn, moved quietly from table to table, her expression strained and downcast. Evelyn watched as Alana served the guests with a forced smile, the spark of arrogance that had once defined her, now replaced with a hollow look of resignation. Her once carefully styled hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her polished demeanor had faded into exhaustion. Evelyn's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile as she took in the scene. The poetic justice of the moment was undeniable. Alana, who had once reveled in Daniel's wealth, now lived on the opposite side of the equation, her privileges stripped away along with her illusions of grandeur. The young woman who had once taunted Evelyn, who had flaunted her place by Daniel's side, was now reduced to a life of servitude ironic, given her smug arrogance back when she believed herself untouchable. Evelyn waited until Alana approached her table, watching as she carefully balanced a tray of drinks, her movements meticulous but devoid of the ease she once carried. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and Alana froze, recognition dawning in her gaze. Evelyn did not say a word, simply lifting her champagne glass with a calm, serene smile. The silence between them was heavy, filled with an understanding that needed no words. Evelyn's smile spoke of triumph, of justice served, while Alana's expression betrayed a mix of shame, bitterness, and resignation. She understood the depth of Evelyn's victory without Evelyn having to utter a single syllable. "Your drink, ma'am," Alana managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper as she set the glass down. Her gaze dropped, unable to meet Evelyn's steady, knowing look. "Thank you," Evelyn replied smoothly, her voice as calm as the waves lapping at the ship's sides. She took a sip, savoring the moment, relishing the sense of closure that washed over her. For a brief moment, Alana hesitated, as if wanting to say something, perhaps to explain or justify her actions. But the weight of her position, the consequences of her choices, seemed to hold her back. Instead, she gave a stiff nod and moved away, leaving Evelyn to her peace. As Alana disappeared into the crowd, Evelyn leaned back, closing her eyes and taking a slow, deep breath. This life was hers, Noah life, free of the shadows of her past, a life reclaimed from the ruins Daniel had left behind. She had come full circle, but this time, she was no longer on the outside looking in. She had taken control of her story, rewritten the ending, and emerged stronger than ever. The soft hum of the ship's engines and the gentle sway of the ocean created a soothing rhythm, and Evelyn allowed herself to relax, a sense of serenity settling over her. She had come a long way from the woman who had once mourned the loss of a husband, the woman who had rebuilt her life piece by painful piece, only to find herself betrayed once more. Now, she was stronger, wiser, and no longer bound by the pain of her past. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm glow across the deck, Evelyn lifted her glass once more, a quiet toast to herself and the journey she had endured. She had fought for justice, reclaimed her power, and found the peace she deserved. Her past was behind her, and before her lay a future she had carved out with her own hands. Evelyn's thoughts drifted, but they were no longer filled with regrets or pain. Instead, she looked forward to the possibilities ahead, knowing she had the freedom to shape her own path. The life she had once built with Daniel was gone, but in its place was something far more precious, her own hard-won happiness. The ship continued its journey across the ocean, carrying Evelyn forward into a future unburdened by the weight of betrayal and loss. As the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had fought to reclaim. With a final, satisfied smile, Evelyn set her glass down, letting the warm breeze carry away the last remnants of her past. She was ready for whatever lay ahead, confident and at peace, knowing that she had reclaimed her life, her story, and her future. And that is how Evelyn reclaimed her life, turning betrayal into empowerment and finding justice in the end. Do you think she made the right choices in exposing Daniel and taking control of her future? What was your favorite moment in her journey? And do you believe she truly found peace? Let us know in the comments below. If Evelyn's story of resilience and triumph over heartbreak inspired you, do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that dive into the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Thank you for watching,